A twig snapped like a gunshot under the snow, and the world tightened to a single, sharp thread of sound. Breath hitched in their throats. The aurora above braided itself into a slow, green seam that seemed suddenly too bright. He froze, every muscle a wire. She pressed closer, the damp of her hair a cold smear against his shoulder. The night had teeth. They moved again, but slower, as if speed would make them louder. Boots sank and rose in a rhythm that had nothing to do with haste, only the careful arithmetic of staying unseen. The ridge behind them fell away into a valley of black trees and white, and the path they followed was a thin scar across the land. Wind cut at their faces with a blade of cold. Snow hissed in the air like a warning. The pines leaned away as if listening. Her hand found his sleeve and held on. Not a plea. A tether. He felt the small, human weight of her fingers, the damp press of skin through wool. The rune at her throat pulsed beneath the linen, a faint blue coin that answered the night with a light like a heartbeat. Each pulse was a metronome for their flight. The closer the riders came, the brighter it burned. He kept his spear loose at his side, the haft a familiar weight. He had been a man of lines and orders. Now he moved by instinct and the ledger of the land. He read the snow the way a man reads a map. Broken crust where a fox had run, a smear where a deer had slid, the faint, wrong pattern of a boot that did not belong to the valley. He listened for the wrongness. The wrongness was a rhythm that did not match wind or animal. She shivered, not from cold, but from something that ran deeper. The rune answered with a small flare, and the light under her skin made the snow at their feet look like a pool of moonlight. Her breath came in thin pools. The bruise at her temple darkened with each inhale. She had been pulled from the river and kept by a bargain. The bargain had a memory, and the memory had teeth. When the rune pulsed, she flinched, as if the river had touched her from within. They skirted a stand of birch, whose trunks were pale as bone. The trees made a tunnel of green and white, and the world narrowed to the sound of their boots, and the small, human rhythm of two chests learning to match. He kept his hand at the small of her back, a steadying pressure that said more than words. She leaned into it as if it were a rope thrown across a dark current. The closeness between them had become a thing that carried meaning, dangerous, binding, and utterly human. She tried to speak once, a whisper that the wind swallowed. "They will not stop," she said, and the words were a ledger entry, not a plea. Shame braided with fear in her voice. They will take what the river gave. The rune pulsed in sympathy. A bell struck underwater. The light under her skin brightened and then dimmed, as if the mark itself were listening for a name. He wanted to answer with a soldier's certainty. He wanted to promise a shield of spear and bone. Instead, he tightened his grip and let the promise be in the pressure of his hand. "Then we move," he said, voice low, the words a rope thrown across the dark. "We move until the ledger forgets the margin." The vow was small and dangerous. It was enough for now. They picked their way down into a hollow, where the snow lay softer and the tracks of others were easier to read. Fresh prints marred the white, too many, too deliberate. A line of hoof prints cut across the slope, the deep, measured stamp of horses that had not yet tired. Between them, smaller prints, boots, the kind that carry men who know how to hunt. The pattern was not random. It was a line drawn by intent. She stopped, fingers digging into his sleeve. The rune at her throat flared bright. a white thread that ran like a vein beneath the linen. Pain crossed her face like a shadow. The river's memory had a way of waking when the ledger's collectors drew near. He felt the air change, the way a man feels a storm before the first drop. A horn answered from the ridge, low and rolling, and the sound made the pines whisper. It was not a casual call. It was a summons. Torches bobbed like angry stars along the far path, and the riders moved with the patient certainty of men who read ledgers for profit. The wind carried their voices, low, precise, the kind that gives orders and expects them kept. He crouched and traced the fresh prints with a gloved finger, the cold biting through leather. The impressions were new, the edges crisp. Someone had passed this way not long before. The line of tracks led toward them, then veered, then doubled back as if testing the wind. The pattern was a question, and the answer was closing. A voice, thin and deliberate, carried on the wind. Too close to be a shout, too clear to be wind. It said a name that had been used to find her before. Nerith. The syllable fell into the hollow like a stone. He had to choose in the space of a heartbeat, hide in the birch, run the ridge, stand and fight, or trust a path he did not know. The choice sat in his chest like a stone. Snow hissed underfoot. The aurora braided the sky into a slow, green seam that made the world look stitched and fragile. Behind them, the riders moved like a tide. Ahead, the land offered only thin promises. She caught his sleeve with a hand that trembled, but did not let go. Her eyes were wide and raw, the bruise at her temple a dark bloom. The rune at her throat pulsed beneath the linen, a blue coin that answered the night with a heartbeat of light. "They will not take me for what I am," she said, voice low and urgent. "They will take what I remember." The words fell into the cold like a stone and made the pines hush. He had expected bargains and debts, names traded in fevered rooms. He had not expected the way her confession rearranged the world. "What do you mean?" he asked, but the question was small and useless in the face of the ledger she carried under skin. She swallowed, and the motion made the bruise at her throat move like a tide. "The mark keeps accounts," she said, "not only of me, of what I have touched, of what I have named. If they read it, if they pry the rune, they will not only see me. They will see the names I gave away. They will find the child I saved. They will find the debt I paid." Her fingers tightened on his sleeve until the wool creased. Shame and fear braided in her voice. "They will not stop at me." The choice sharpened. Hide and hope the riders passed. Run and risk being overtaken on open snow. Stand and fight a band of men on horses. Or trust the one thing he had, a memory of a path through a ravine where horses could not follow. A narrow throat of rock and old pines that swallowed sound. He could see the line of it in his mind, the way the basalt cut the wind, the way a man could move like a shadow if he knew the steps. It was a risk. It was a promise. He chose the ravine. "Down there," he said, voice low, the words a rope thrown across the dark. "We move into the throat. Horses cannot follow. We move fast and we do not stop." The decision felt like a blade. It felt like a vow. She nodded, and for a moment the world narrowed to the press of two bodies. He lifted her with the careful strength of a man who had carried the wounded and the dead, and learned the difference by touch. Her weight was a small, living thing against his chest. The damp of her hair left a river scent on his cloak. He moved with the hush of someone who knows how to make no sound, and she leaned into him as if his shoulder were a rope thrown across a river. They slipped into the ravine like thieves. The pines closed above them, and the wind lost its teeth. Snow fell in a soft hush that swallowed tracks. The path narrowed to a deer run, then to nothing but the soft, yielding slope of old avalanches. He kept his spear loose at his side, the hafti, a familiar weight. He kept his hand at the small of her back, a steadying pressure that said more than words. The closeness between them deepened in the hush, fingers brushing, a shoulder pressed, the way their breaths began to match, like two oars finding rhythm in the same current. She spoke then, a whisper that the ravine took and made private. "I remember a child's laugh," she said, and the memory was a shard that did not fit the present. "I remember a woman's hands cupping a fevered chest. I remember offering a name into the dark and the river taking a seam in return." The rune pulsed beneath the linen, a thin blue coin that made the air taste of iron. "Sometimes I think the river kept me whole. Sometimes I think it kept me for itself." He wanted to answer with a soldier's certainty. He wanted to promise a shield of spear and bone. Instead, he tightened his grip and let the promise be in the pressure of his hand. "Then we keep moving," he said. "We keep moving until the ledger forgets the margin." The vow was small and dangerous. It was enough for now. They moved through the throat of rock, and the world narrowed to breath and the scrape of boots. The ravine bent and opened into a small hollow, where the snow lay deeper and the trees made a ring. He set her down behind a fallen trunk and scanned the ridge above with the practiced eye of a hunter. Tracks cut the slope, fresh, deliberate, the deep stamp of horses that had not yet tired. The riders had not been fooled by the sanctuary's silence. They had read the ledger of tracks and followed the line. A sound rose then, not the measured drum of hooves, but something small and impossible. A child's laugh, thin and bright, threading through the pines. It was a sound that did not belong to the night. It made his chest tighten with a thing that was not fear and not hope, but both braided together. She flinched as if the sound had touched the rune itself. Her hand flew to her throat, and the mark pulsed white-hot beneath the linen. Pain crossed her face like a shadow. The river's memory had been stirred. From the ridge above, a raven dropped into a bare branch, and a scrap of leather fluttered to the snow at Einar's feet. He bent and picked it up with gloved fingers. A wax seal had been broken, and a smear of ink marked the hide. A spear crossed with a crown. The symbol was the king's. He did not need to read the words to know the ledger had been opened by those who keep the highest accounts. A voice answered from the ridge, low and precise, and the syllable it carried was a name that had been used to find her before. Nerith. The name fell into the hollow like a stone. She remembered the stone before she saw it, a face of bone-carved runes and a hollow where offerings had once been laid, a memory like a bruise that made the air taste of iron. The recollection came as a single, bright shard, an image of hands passing a token. A woman in reed crowns, the river's black seam running through a hall of names, and it pulled the world taut. He saw the change in her at once. The way her shoulders hunched, the way the rune at her throat answered with a thread of light that trembled like a bell. They found the shrine in a hollow ringed by pines, half swallowed by snow and lichen. It was not a temple so much as a ledger set in stone. A standing slab the colour of old bone, its face carved with interlaced lines that looked like ribs and rivers, names scored into the surface in a hand that had learned to count. A shallow basin at its base held the ghosts of offerings: pebble, bone, a strip of leather with a faded seal. Someone had once come here to bargain and had left a mark that the weather had not yet erased. The rune at her throat flared when they stepped into the hollow, a white-hot thread that ran like a vein beneath linen. The light struck the carved lines and they answered, faint and blue, as if the stone itself remembered the touch of hands. The air around the slab smelled of peat and old prayers. The snow at its feet had melted in a thin halo, steam rising like breath. The world felt older here, as if the ledger of the land had been opened and the margins were being read aloud. She reached out before he could stop her, fingers trembling. Her palm hovered over the basin, and the rune answered with a violent flare that made her gasp. Pain crossed her face like a shadow. The mark under her skin pulsed and then convulsed, as if something beneath it had been struck. She clutched at her throat, nails biting into damp cloth, and a sound came from her that was not a word, but a memory. The hiss of water over stone, the small, hot weight of a child's chest cupped in hands. He moved to her side, hands steady, though his heart had become a drum. He had seen men taken by fever and by grief. He had not seen a mark answer a place like this. The sight of her in pain made something in him go raw. He pressed his palm to her back, the contact a small human anchor. "Breathe," he said, voice low, the soldier's steadiness returning like a shield. The words were small and useful. They steadied her for a moment. The memory that struck her was not whole. It came in shards, a hall of stone where candles guttered, a woman passing a token across a table, a child's laugh like a bell, a ledger opened and a name taken. She mouthed the shapes of the token without naming it, and the sight of her lips forming the motion made the carved lines on the stone seem to stir. The rune under her skin pulsed in time with the images, a small, patient drum that grew louder until it felt like thunder in the hollow. He crouched and brushed snow from the basin with a gloved hand. Beneath the frost lay a small thing, a carved bone the size of a coin, its surface etched with the same knot of lines as the rune at her throat. The token fit the memory like a key. When his fingers closed around it, the rune flared so bright that the pines seemed to lean away. Pain lanced across her face. She cried out, a sound that made the carved names on the slab look like teeth. The bone was warm in his hand, as if it had been kept near a hearth. The etching matched the mark at her throat, an interlace of strokes that read like a name and like a debt. He felt the air change, the aurora above braided tighter, a green seam that made the hollow's shadows long and thin. The carved lines on the stone threw blue tongues of light that licked at the token in his palm. The world felt like a ledger being balanced. She whispered then, words that were not quite a sentence. "I gave it to save him," she said, voice thin as a thread. "I gave a name and the river took a seam." The confession was a thing folded in on itself. Mercy and theft braided together. The rune pulsed in answer. A bell struck underwater. The hollow filled with the scent of peat and iron and something older, like river stone warmed by sun. He wanted to ask who the child had been, what life had been bought with that name. He wanted to know whether the bargain had been mercy or a theft that would be paid in full. But the questions felt too blunt for the ledger that hummed under her skin. Instead, he set the bone token back in the basin, and let his fingers hover over it, as if the touch could be a promise. The closeness between them deepened in the hush. Fingers brushing, a shoulder pressed, the way their breaths began to match, like two oars finding rhythm in the same current. The carved slab answered them then, not with words, but with emotion that made the snow at its base shiver. A thin line of steam rose from the basin and coalesced into a shape that was not quite mist and not quite voice. It smelled of river and old prayers. The rune at her throat flared white-hot, and the light ran like a river beneath the linen. The hollow filled with a sound like water over stone, and, beneath it, a whisper that was older than the market's gossip. A presence stirred in the carved lines, a memory waking. The stone's face seemed to breathe. Something answered from the depth of the slab. A voice like a bell struck underwater, and it said a name that made the air go cold. His breath was on her mouth, hot and ragged in the cold, and for a heartbeat, the world narrowed to that single, impossible nearness. Snow hissed at the cliff's lip. The pines leaned in like listeners. He could feel the pulse of the rune under her linen against his palm, quick, bright, a small moon beneath skin, and the closeness between them was a thing that made the air thin. The night held its breath with them. They had pushed until their legs trembled, and the cold had begun to take the edges off thought. The ravine opened into a shallow cave, where basalt overhung like a jaw. It was a poor shelter, but it was shelter. He dragged a fallen branch inside and coaxed a small fire from resin and flint. The flame was a stubborn thing, a low sun that threw their faces into soft relief and made the rune at her throat flare in sympathy. Heat licked at their cheeks. The smoke smelled of pine and old promises. She sat with her knees drawn up, furs wrapped tight, and watched the fire as if it were a thing that might answer. The bruise at her temple had darkened to a bruise of memory. Her fingers trembled when she smoothed the furs over her shoulders. He moved to her without thinking, the soldier's reflex softened by the hush. His hand found the seam at her wrist and lingered there, the touch a small, dangerous benediction. "You should not have come for me," she said, voice thin as a thread. The words were not accusation so much as a fact laid bare. The rune pulsed beneath the linen, a blue coin that drank the firelight and gave it back in a cold thread. "They will not stop at me. They will read what I have named, and they will take more than I bargained for." He wanted to answer with a plan, with the blunt certainty of a man who had held lines and buried men. Instead, he let his fingers trace the pale seam along his forearm, the scar he had shown her in the sanctuary, and let the silence be the thing that spoke. The fire hummed. The cave stone threw back the light in thin, blue tongues. For a moment the world was only breath and the small, human heat between them. She watched him as if measuring whether the promise in his eyes would hold. "My name is not Nerith," she said suddenly, and the confession fell into the smoke like a coin. "That is what they call me when they read the ledger. My name is Astrid." The syllable was a small, fragile thing, and when it left her mouth, it sounded like a bell in the hollow. The rune answered with a faint flare, as if the mark itself had heard and acknowledged the truth. He repeated the name softly, tasting it like a new word. "Astrid," he said, and the way he said it made something in her loosen. The closeness between them deepened, no longer only shelter, but recognition. He had been a man who kept his wants small. Now he felt the dangerous pull of wanting to keep her whole. She swallowed, and the motion made the bruise at her throat move like a tide. "I gave a name to the river," she whispered. "I thought it would be enough. I thought I could buy a life with a word." Her fingers curled around the furs as if to hold herself together. The rune pulsed in answer. A bell struck underwater. But the mark remembers more than I do. It remembers what I touched, what I named. It remembers the child's laugh and the woman's hands. Sometimes I wake, and I do not know which parts are mine. He leaned closer, the firelight painting his cheek in orange and blue. The temptation to close the last inches between them was a physical ache. He could feel the warmth of her breath, the damp of her hair, the way her pulse fluttered under his palm. The world outside the cave was a ledger of boots and torches. Inside, the moment felt like a sacrament. "Then we will keep your name safe," he said, voice low. "I will carry it in my mouth and in my blood. I will not let them read it from your skin." The vow was a thing that rearranged the air. The fire flared as if in recognition. The carved runes in his memory, those old marks in the sanctuary, seemed to answer with a faint, approving glow. She closed her eyes, and the motion made her lashes brush his knuckles. For a breath, the cave held only the two of them, and the small, dangerous promise between their lips. He wanted to tell her the name of the boy he had failed to save, to lay his own ledger bare and make the exchange. Your name for mine, your debt for mine. The words hovered and did not fall. Instead, he let his forehead rest against hers, a benediction without sound. Their breaths matched. The rune's light steadied, a thin blue coin beneath linen. The fire smoke curled upward, and the cave stone seemed to lean in. The near kiss hung between them like a held breath, too close to be undone, too fragile to be claimed. Then the night answered them with a sound that was not wind. A twig snapped outside, sharp and deliberate. A shadow moved across the cave's mouth. The fire's light flared, and the rune at her throat pulsed white-hot, as if struck by a bell. The hush broke. They were not alone. The wind carried a name like a blade. The king. It came not as a shout, but as a hush that threaded the pines, a syllable that made the snow at their feet seem to listen. The hollow answered with a sound like a ledger closing. For a moment, the world felt smaller, as if the sky itself had leaned in to hear what the ridge had to say. They had sheltered in a shallow hollow beneath a stand of pines, the trees' trunks pale as bone, and their branches braided overhead like fingers. The fire between them was a low, stubborn sun that threw their faces into soft relief. The rune at her throat pulsed beneath linen, a blue coin that drank the light and gave it back in a cold thread. The air smelled of resin and old prayers. He had thought the danger was only men with torches. He had not expected the weight of a crown to press down on the night. She flinched when the name brushed the hollow. The bruise at her temple darkened, as if the memory of the river had folded back on itself. "They ride for the king," she said, voice thin and urgent. The words were not new. They had been a rumor in market stalls and a threat in the mouths of men who kept their heads low. But spoken here, in the hush between two breaths, the syllables rearranged the world. The rune at her throat flared in answer. A bell struck underwater. He had seen the king's sigil before, on a broken banner at a burned farm, on a wax seal that had fluttered from a rider's cloak. It was a spear crossed with a crown, simple and hard as iron. The seal had been on the scrap of leather they had found in the ravine. Now the name itself was the seal. The riders were not mere hunters. They were instruments of a will that reached like a net across the valleys. They wanted her alive because the king wanted what the rune could tell him. She pressed her fingers to the hollow of her throat as if to hold the mark in place. "They will not kill me," she whispered, and the sentence was a small, terrible thing. "They will take me to the king. He will read the rune. He will ask it questions I do not know how to answer." Her eyes were wide and raw, shame and fear braided in the syllables. "He will pry the names from me. He will find what I tried to hide." The idea of the king reading the rune made the fire's light seem suddenly too small. The ledger the river kept was not a private thing. It was a map of debts and favors, of names that could be used like keys. If the king could read the mark, he could read the margins of the world. He could call names and make men answer. He could unmake bargains. He felt the old, stubborn line of duty tighten in his chest, and then break into something else. He had been a soldier who obeyed orders. He had buried men who had followed orders and men who had broken them. To shelter her was to shelter a thing the king had declared his. To move with her was to move against the crown. The word rose in him like a bitter taste. Treason. The thought of treason did not make him step back. It made his jaw set. The ledger of his life had been neat and small. Now a margin had been written in a hand that did not ask permission. He looked at her, at the bruise, at the river scent in her hair, at the way her fingers trembled when she tried to hold herself together, and the choice hardened into a vow. He would be the wall. He would be the ledger they could not read. "You will not go to him," he said, voice low, the soldier's steadiness returning like a shield. The words were not a plan, so much as a promise. "I will not let them take you to a hall where names are used like weapons." The fire answered with a low crackle. The rune pulsed in sympathy, a thin blue coin beneath linen. She looked at him then, and the look was a thing that made the world tilt. Fear and gratitude and something like recognition braided in her gaze. "If they take me," she said, voice small, "they will find the child. They will find the woman who gave the name. They will find the ledger of what I touched." The confession was a thing folded in on itself. Mercy and theft braided together. "They will not stop at me." He thought of the boy he had failed to save, of the scar along his forearm, of the small mercies that had kept him from becoming a man who only obeyed. He thought of the market woman he had watched from a distance, and the way a hand can be both a tool and a benediction. The thought of the king holding her like a coin to be read made his blood run cold. Treason was a word that could end a life. It could also be a shield. They made a plan that was not a plan. Move at dusk, keep to the pines, find a crossing where the river ran shallow, and the riders could not follow. The vow between them was a thin thing, dangerous and binding. He would carry her name in his mouth and in his blood. He would not let the king read the rune. The night answered with a sound that was not wind. A raven dropped into a bare branch, and a scrap of leather fluttered to the snow at his feet. The king's seal stamped in wax, broken and fresh. The sight of it made the hollow feel like a throat about to be opened. From the ridge, a torch flared, and a shadow rose against the aurora like a spear. More lights followed, a slow, patient line that cut the dark. The riders had found the path they had taken. The torches moved with a certainty that made the pines whisper. too close to outrun. They were already there. Torches a ring of hungry stars, spears planted like teeth in the snow, riders dismounted and forming a circle that cut the night into a throat. The air went thin. Metal sang against leather. Horses snorted and stamped, steam rising in white ghosts. Breath came sharp in the cold. The world narrowed to the ring of men and the two figures at its center. Einar stepped forward without thinking, the motion a muscle memory that had nothing to do with orders and everything to do with the shape of a promise. He put himself between Astrid and the nearest spear, the haft of his spear a line of intent across his chest. Snow hissed under his boots. His breath fogged and hung like a small, stubborn flag. The riders' torches painted his face in hard orange. The rune at Astrid's throat answered with a thin, blue coin beneath linen, bright as a heartbeat. Around them, the riders moved with the slow, patient certainty of men who have been given a command and learned to obey it without asking why. Cloaks brushed snow, spurs clicked. A leader stepped forward, tall, furred, the king's sigil on his breast catching the torchlight in a hard, indifferent gleam. His voice was low and precise, the kind that gives orders and expects them kept. By the king's will, he said, and the words fell into the hush like a verdict. Bring her alive. Nerith is to be taken to the Hall of Spears. The king will read the mark and call the names. The syllables rearrange the night. The Hall of Spears, an image like a blade in the mind, made the air taste of iron. The riders' faces were masks of duty. Their hands rested on hilts. The leader's eyes were cold as a winter well. No blood, he added, as if that were mercy. Not until she stands before the king. Astrid's fingers flew to her throat, as if to hold the rune in place. The bruise at her temple darkened, shame and fear braided in her gaze. You cannot, she began, but the leader's hand cut the word like a blade. You bargained with the river, the leader said, voice flat. You named what was not yours to name. The king will ask who you saved, who you stole from the ledger. He will call names and make men answer. He will take what he needs. The torchlight made the carved sigil on his cloak look like a promise and a threat at once. Einar's jaw set. Treason was a word that had weight. It had ended men. He had thought of it as a thing other men did. Now it sat in his mouth like a stone. To shelter her was to shelter what the king had claimed. To stand between her and the riders was to stand against a crown. The ledger of his life had been neat and small. Now a margin had been written in a hand that did not ask permission. He planted his spear and let the haft rest against his shoulder. You will not take her, he said, voice low and steady. The words were not a plan. They were a line drawn in the snow. I will not let you take her to any hall where names are used like weapons. A ripple of movement answered him. Torches bobbed. A rider laughed once, a sound like a blade being sharpened. The leader's face did not change. He stepped closer, the snow crunching under his boots. Up close, the sigil on his cloak was a spear crossed with a crown, simple and hard as iron. He looked at Astrid as if she were a ledger to be read. You do not understand what you protect, the leader said, and the words were a blade wrapped in silk. The king does not merely read names, he makes them answer. He will call the child you saved. He will call the woman whose hands you cupped. He will call the debt you paid and demand its price. He will use the mark to find what you hid. Astrid's eyes found Einar's. There was terror there, yes, but also a fierce, private steadiness. Someone who had bargained with the river and come back with a seam sewn into her flesh. "Then kill me," she whispered, voice thin as a thread. "If it ends the ledger." The leader's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "The king commands she be brought alive," he said. "Alive, so the hall may hear the names. Alive, so the king may decide what to do with what the rune reveals." He turned his head, and the circle tightened like a noose. "Bind him," he added, and the command was a stone thrown into still water. Hands moved, ropes were produced with the efficiency of men who had bound many things before. A rider stepped forward, blade glinting. The torchlight caught the edge and made it a thin, hungry line. Einar's hand tightened on his spear. He could feel the weight of the moment, of the vow he had made in the sanctuary, of the scar along his forearm, of the boy he had failed to save. He had promised to be a wall. The wall was about to be tested. "Drop your spear," the leader said, voice low and final. "Drop it and kneel. The king will decide what to do with those who defy him." Einar's muscles coiled. The world narrowed to the press of metal and the sound of his own blood. He could see the torches reflected in Astrid's eyes, the rune at her throat a bright, impossible coin. He could see the riders' faces, set like stone. He could see the path that led to the Hall of Spears, a place where names were called and debts were paid. He did not move to drop his spear. The rider with the blade stepped forward, the steel a whisper in the snow. The leader's hand rested on the pommel of his own sword, ready. "Then kill him," the leader said, and the command fell into the circle like a blade. Thank you for being here. I hope you enjoyed this chapter. This tale is inspired by Nordic dreams and heart. Stay close for the next chapter of this saga. With love, Claire.